Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the case of an 18-year-old Muslim girl who was arrested at a Black Lives Matter protest in Miami, Florida. And in and of itself, that's not a very unique event, because there have been a lot of protesters who have been arrested at these protests throughout the U.S. and even in other parts of the world, such as the U.K. and otherwise, for various reasons, whether legitimate or not. Of course, that can be discussed as far as the allegations against her. Nevertheless, when she was being booked within a Miami County jail, her hijab was forcibly removed, even after she verbally said to the officers that she did not want for her hijab to be removed, and that it was within her religious rights and freedoms within the U.S. To have her hijab on, even for a booking photo. She was not listened to. Her hijab was removed forcibly, and it was kept off, according to her and her lawyer, for up to 7 hours while she was behind bars. She has now been freed, according to the social media post that she has put up. However, this does then go back to a disturbing pattern, possibly. And I did just a cursory research online about, and this is more specifically about, Black Muslim women who have been arrested over the past number of years. And there are cases going back all the way to 2005 with Jamila Medina, who was accused of being a terrorist at that time by the LA County Sheriff, and her hijab was forcibly removed. In 2017, Kirsty Powell also settled a lawsuit with Long Beach for a similar case. Then just last year at Self-Care, which is the Council of American Islamic Relations, defended Siwatu Salamara, who had also filed a civil rights complaint against Michigan, in fact, county, and again, for the fact that her hijab was not allowed to be on while she was being arrested. So let's discuss that a bit further. What does this mean at this point in time within an atmosphere, as we know, of heightened tensions, especially in context of these Black Lives Matter protests that are still very much taking place? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Saeed, who is joining us from Detroit, Michigan. He's a senior lecturer of Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University. He's also co-authored a book on Islamophobia. Joining us this morning from Syracuse, New York, is Mariam Durrani, who is an anthropology professor at Hamilton College. Mariam and Saeed, thank you both for your time this morning. Mariam, let me start with you. What do you make of the case of Ala Masri, a young girl arrested at a BLM protest? Of course, the details of that arrest in and of itself are disturbing, where it seems that what's been alleged to be against her, as in her fighting off police apparently, is also seemingly false, according to her lawyer. But then for her hijab to be forcibly removed, what do you make of that?
I think from this, what we can see is an example of gendered carceral domination by the U.S. state. I think it aligns with the reasons for the protest, which is to protest the prison and policing system here in the U.S. and the way that that system is disproportionately experienced by Black and Muslim, Indigenous, and Latinx populations, Asian populations. So this, problem that we have in the United States specifically, and in the larger part of the world as well, around white supremacy, is being highlighted here because anti-Muslim racism is part of the carceral state in multiple ways, including the ways that women are mistreated and targeted by police officers in this way.
Saeed, the defense on the part of some is that, listen, they needed to check under her hijab to make sure she wasn't carrying any weapons or the otherwise. But then, as her lawyer put in it, as is logical, she could have had somebody of the same gender check her in a private room. Why do you think those very logical processes were not followed?
Operate outside the bounds of logic. And this is, as Mariam aptly put, part of state power. If one goes to any airport, one knows, as Mariam said, that one can go ahead and elect to have someone of the same gender go ahead and check in case there is some situation or the possibility of a weapon or contraband underneath that. But we also have technology today, which is far more intrusive, if you will, in being able to penetrate even the body to find any kind of metal or other foreign agent that could be seen as a risk or a threat. This is clearly meant for two reasons. One is to assert the police power of the state, and then also to serve as a deterrent for anybody else who might feel as though they would be emboldened and empowered to take a stance in what is clearly then seen as a violation of civil liberties and civil rights.
Mariam, as if it wasn't enough that this happened, the jail then went ahead and released Ala's photos to media outlets, right? And even actually while I was doing research for this show, unfortunately, I came across quite a few of her pictures without hijab on, of course, without her permission. And I imagine that takes a whole other level of, I don't know if the word is hatred or ignorance. What do you think that is down to, that they would actually release the photos to the booking photo, while well knowing that it's against her rights and against her will for that to be out there?
It seems to me that both of the actions that were taken by the police and also by the booking agency are actually demonstrative of the fact that they do understand the significance of the hijab, and then actually then the hijab becomes a site to assert state power through this kind of disrespect to her while she was being booked. And then also subsequently now there is a digital stain of this experience that will live on, and they continue to do this kind of targeting to Muslim women, especially this young woman who is out there protesting and trying to speak up for those who cannot speak. So I think that is a really kind of marked sign that they do understand how the hijab functions.
And Saeed, I wonder, as you alluded to in your first answer there, this is all meant to, of course, deflect and warn people, right, from even taking part in these protests, I imagine. Do you think that there will be some success in that regard, or will this just strengthen people's resolve in that regard?
It seems as though the latter is probably going to be the case, Waqar. Those who are working in these spaces are already quite painfully aware of the risks. I mean, after all, the protests have to do with police brutality, and particularly the treatment of people of color, and even more specifically Black Americans. And so the idea then that you have somebody with the courage of Ms. Masri out there will probably serve then as a beacon for others to feel as though they will take up the mantle as well. Because after all, as Mariam said, that not only then is there the stigma of a police record that the police wants to then assert, but also the social stigma of this. I mean, her charges will most likely be dropped. She'll probably be ticketed at worst. But the fact that nothing ever goes away on the internet, that these photographs will be out there in perpetuity, means that, again, there will be a continued violation of her. But if then this is something that the police would have thought would dissuade others from joining the movement, I think they're sadly mistaken.
Mariam, I wanted to just in a more macro way, right, and not just talk about Islamophobia specifically, because we have the otherization of minorities happening in the U.S., right? And there was just an interesting poll and survey carried out. I believe it was within the U.S. Census that this was discovered, that within the under 16 age category, we now have a majority in the U.S. who are now non-white, as in non-white Hispanics and other people of color, of course. That also then talks about what's being feared on the part of many on the other side, or the far right, if I may call them that, about they're losing the demographic war as well. Do you think that plays out into all of this with the way that authorities possibly are reacting to such incidences?
I do. I think the nativist, kind of white supremacist turn that we're seeing in the U.S., especially marked since the Tea Party, since the election of Obama and the response within the Republican Party, and then more recently with Trump's election and his regime, we are seeing the ways that there is this paranoia within particular segments of the white U.S. population. However, I think there's also this kind of misunderstanding in a sense that, the concerns of all people of color are exactly the same, and that we are somehow one large block. And I think this goes further to kind of speak to the way that race is understood as rooted in the body, as opposed to rooted in these systems of domination and subjugation. And so I think these protests, which are revolutionary in the sense of how they are going about making this critique of state power. And I think Ms. Masri's social media response and other young people's social media response in support of her is demonstrating that that awareness, or that racial politics is actually not about about all of us being the same, but actually being united against this oppressive power, and that is that is open for everyone. And so in the U.S., you see that the protests are not being attended only, for example, or by Black and brown, people, but actually that you have a diverse coalition at these protests, because a lot of people are realizing that there is something that needs to be done and changed urgently.
So that in some ways, can this be seen as growing pains almost, where the U.S. is growing into a society which is now accepting the fact that it is that Americans come in all colors, as we may say?
Well, some would see these as growing pains. Others would see these as death spasms of a certain kind of America that will not go gentle into that good night, so to speak. 6 years ago, I co-authored a piece called Manufacturing Bigotry, in which we identified that at the state legislative level, there was an integrated campaign to go ahead and try to disenfranchise various demographic groups, whether it was in anti-immigration legislation, anti-gender discrimination in trying to be more restrictive when it comes to access to reproductive rights, anti-mosque, anti-Sharia, anti-voter access, which of course disproportionately affects minority communities, anti-union. And we found that one political party, here the Republican Party, was really responsible for all of these kinds of restrictive legislation. So when we take a look at the various pieces of this apparatus, as Mariam alluded to, we have the police, but then we also have politicians. And now we have this whole idea of a segment of civil society, which is having this moral panic that the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant essential component of American identity is becoming less white and more brown, less Anglo-Saxon and more Latin American, and less Protestant and more either Catholic or non-affiliation. And for some, that's shaking them to a very existential core.
All right, Mariam, I'll give you the final word before I let you both go. Do you think, Mariam, going forward then, with the kind of polarization that we have currently, right? We have Trump on one hand, and he's said very openly in the past that he believes Islam hates America or the U.S. It's hard to know what he was terming the other side exactly as, but nevertheless, he said Islam hates us. And then on the other side, we have seemingly quite a bit of unity, right, within other parts of society, be it within minorities or even the larger society, the Caucasian society as well. Will we continue to see this sort of polarization, or do you think that this is sort of diminishing now?
No, I think this pandemic has made it perfectly clear that there's a large degree of economic inequality in this country that is becoming more and more apparent. The fact that we have the police officers at these protests who are fully dressed as if they're going into war, and you have doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals arguing and asking for basic protective equipment. I think we're seeing that there is a larger issue here than the way that this certain leaders try to turn this into some type of culture war. That there's actually systemic change that needs to take place in order to create more equity and dignity for all people here that are living in the U.S. So I think that there is a lot more at stake, and that the young people and the people out there who are protesting, who are fighting this movement right now, understand those stakes very well.
Very well, Mariam and Saeed, we appreciate your time this morning. We'll be back, viewers, right after this break, continuing the discussion on Islamophobia within the U.S. and specifically the case of Al-Masri and the fact that her hijab was removed without her permission, forcibly, and that her booking photo then was spread around the internet. I'll be back right after this. Thank you for staying with us, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and continue to discuss the case of Al-Masri, the young girl who was arrested and then her hijab removed in Miami during Black Lives Matter protests that she was taking part in. Those pictures of her without hijab have now spread on the internet, as I also found while researching her case today online. And that, of course, will remain with her for the rest of her life, unless, of course, as her lawyer wants, authorities are able to remove all those photos, which I imagine at this point would be very hard to do. Let's discuss all of that a bit further with our guests who are joining us now. We're now joined by Nazia Kazi, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at Stockton University. She's also the author of Islamophobia, Race and Global Politics, and she's joining us this morning from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Joining us from the Iranian capital, Tehran, is Hakimeh Saghaye Biria, who is an assistant professor at the University of Tehran. She's also author of the upcoming book called Political Islamophobia at American Policy Institutes, Battling the Power of Islamic Resistance. Hakimeh and Nazia, thank you both for your time today. Nazia, let me start with you. What do you make of the Ala Masri case? I imagine this is meant as a bit of a precedent, right, for the rest of the people who are taking part in those protests, to deflect them and discourage them from taking part in such protests?
Yeah, so the atmosphere at these protests has been nothing shy of repressive. But one thing I would like to point out is that there's been a lot of focus on the crackdown on protesters who are not Black. So for instance, right here in Philadelphia, I'm sure many of your viewers saw the scenes of the spray of tear gas against protesters downtown, which was truly horrific. But a very similar scene erupted in West Philadelphia, where most of the protesters were Black local residents, which didn't get as much press time, right? So, and the reason I bring this up is because while what we've seen at the protests has been a horrible crackdown on journalists, what we see in this case with the Islamophobic incident is really important and telling, but I think we do need to sort of keep a laser focus on what the issue at hand is here, which is anti-Black racism, right? This is what brought the young woman to the protests. That's what motivated a lot of us to sort of break our quarantine and grow into the streets. And I think it's really important to remember that. And second of all, it's important to remember that this type of police violence is not an anomaly. It's not something sort of unusual that pops up in rare instances in the US. This is largely what US police are tasked to do. The history of policing in the US is rooted in two historical facts. One, police were invented to sort of patrol and catch enslaved African descended people who escaped slavery and returned them to their quote unquote owners. And second of all, the police were invented to suppress labor uprisings, right? Workers who were demanding better conditions. So when we see the kind of Islamophobic violence that we see in this particular instance, it really does us a huge service to see it in its larger sort of historical context.
Definitely.
But yes, we do see this type of Islamophobic violence in protest spaces, in airports, anywhere where there's sort of official mechanisms of the US state. You do see this type of Islamophobia.
All right, so Hakimeh, give the international view on this then, right? Because we're all on the outside of the U.S. looking at these protests from the outside in, right, and observing how the U.S. is dealing with these protests at this time. Be it, of course, as Nazia there correctly said, the main issue remains, of course, Black Lives Matters and that protest movement. But then these side issues as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, first of all, I would like to concur with Nazia that we are witnessing something that is not an anomaly. I have heard this from other Muslim ladies who have experienced detention and incarceration at the hands of American police, specifically Marzia Hashemi, one of my friends who had been detained in the U.S. without any charges and then released after a couple of weeks of incarceration. She experienced the same thing. So this is nothing new. It is something that has been directed at Muslim women, but putting it in an international context, this is something that Muslim women have experienced from the colonial period. That is kind of colonial feminism has been directed against Muslim women practicing hijab, making this something that is not viewed as violence against Muslim women on the part of the police. This is something that they feel they have for granted, that they can ask Muslim women who are being detained to take off their hijab. Basically, Muslim women have experienced physical violence against practicing hijab and also ideological violence. Even questioning their very right to wear the hijab in the first place, or viewing it as part of their identity, part of their self. When you take away a Muslim woman's hijab, someone who believes that that is part of their religion, is basically rupturing part of their self. So I think it is best to put it in that international context as well. I would like to add something else, and that is that I think one of the fears that exists is that these kind of protests would widen and become something of an international solidarity against anti-Black racism and against many different types of oppressive dominance that is being directed at different peoples of different religions, different races, and different languages, basically.
Yeah. Oh, Nazia, when you're looking at the details of just what happened to Ala, and I go back to that case just because, you know, a lot of it speaks to me as well because I have family in the U.S. and some of them who do wear this headscarf as well. But just the logic of a young girl telling police officers, listen, and of course we can debate whether or not she should have been arrested to begin with, but beyond that point, a young girl tells police officers, I don't want my hijab removed. That's well within her rights, even according to the Miami County. I read their rules and regulations. It clearly says that you have a right to still wear your headscarf. If you believe that that is important for you. You can be taken into a private room and checked there, etc. But then for those pictures without hijab to then be circulated online by that very county and jail, I mean, that takes a level of, I don't know if the word is hatred, ignorance. What do you think that is down to?
I mean, I think it's important, and I think history will show just how repressive the state aimed to be in this moment. In other words, how many of these tactics are sort of deliberately meant to intimidate protesters? So, you know, and we're slowly starting to learn, for instance, that in Minneapolis, which is sort of the epicenter of these protests where the murder of George Floyd occurred, we know that, you know, law enforcement agencies were told by other law enforcement agencies, you know, to enact huge forms of repression because these were going to be dangerous, violent protests against law enforcement, you know? So I think what time will tell is just how deliberate these intimidation tactics have been. And I have studied enough of America's racial history to know that we don't really put it past the U.S. state to resort to this sort of criminalization of dissent, right? The criminalization of protest and direct action that we see here. It can take many forms, including the violation of a protester's privacy, as we've seen in this case.
And, you know, Hakimeh, again, from the outside, and when we're looking at all this, it seems like the U.S. is trying to discourage unity amongst different minorities. Would that be correct?
I would put it that way as well, yes. It is that a solidarity forming among different races, among different religions, looking for the goal of, removing this kind of oppression from the face of the United States, which is the first step to removing it from the face of the globe. Many people outside the United States are facing the same kind of discrimination and intimidation and violence. You had this, similar scenes in Iraq, in Afghanistan, at the hand of the U.S. military. So basically, I think it is. We have to look at it that way. And also, there is the fact that the U.S. penal system is unusually cruel. To use the title of one of the books written by a scholar in the United States, the unusually cruel nature of the U.S. penal system makes it natural to witness this kind of approach to the protesters and to those who are rightfully asking for their rights, basically. But I think that the international scope is very important. Trying to limit the scope of the protest as much as possible and not have other races and other religions participate in this kind of protests is basically one of the goals of these kind of intimidations.
All right, so Nazia, final word before I let you both go. Do you think that any of this will discourage others from coming out in these protests, yourself or even anybody else, because of these sorts of cases?
I think that is one of the deliberate outcomes of this type of repression. Is there's a chilling effect in society when you see people who have been protesting now looking at years in prison, looking at an arrest case which will make it harder for them to find employment in the future. When you see, their name and picture being sprayed across the internet, that's not like an unfortunate side effect. It might actually be a deliberate target of the heavy policing of this type of uprising. It's really a rebellion that's happening in the US now. This is a deliberate tactic to break up that rebellion.
Very well, Nazia, and we appreciate your time today and, of course, your expert insight. Nazia, they're speaking to us from Philadelphia, and Hakimeh was joining us from Tehran. Now, viewers, we've discussed this case of Ala Masri, a young girl, as I said in my introduction, who has been arrested in the U.S. Now, of course, the details of her arrest as well are up for debate, as her lawyer has put forth and as Ala has also disputed, saying that she was apparently resisting arrest or otherwise. Nevertheless, once she was arrested, her hijab was forcibly removed, even though she verbally said, listen, this is within my rights to have my hijab on, and you can take me to a private room and check me if you so wish with somebody of the same gender. Those rights were not given to her. Then her picture was spread online. I mean, that seems like almost a really, really cruel thing to do, as Hakimeh there had mentioned, where it's like one step too far, right? Where not only are you violating her rights to the fact that she has a right to wearing hijab, even in jail, but then you're also spreading those pictures online for the world to see without her permission. What does this say about Islamophobia within the U.S.? What does this say about the entire atmosphere right now with the Black Lives Matter movement and how the U.S. is really trying to strangle this movement in some ways at this point in time, strangle the solidarity that may very well exist within different classes and different parts of society, be they Muslims and the African-American community or otherwise in other communities as well. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the arrest of a number of Kataib Hezbollah members in Iraq by Iraqi security forces. Now, Kataib Hezbollah is technically a part of Iraqi forces themselves, but is part of the PMF, or the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMUs, Popular Mobilization Units, depending on which term you want to use for them, known as Hashd al-Sha'abi in Arabic. Now, of course, originally they were separate from the Iraqi army and separate from Iraqi security forces because this was during the time, of course, when Iraq was at the height of its fight against ISIS or Daesh. These groups were formed. A lot of these groups, admittedly, are pro-Iran, are Iran-leaning groups, are even backed by Iran in some fashion, be it through weapons or otherwise. Of course, those details can be debated and discussed. Nevertheless, the arrest of 14 Kataib Hezbollah members is not a small deal. Mustafa al-Kadhimi, the new prime minister of Iraq, had promised that he would rein in those security forces who were not listening to his orders and to the orders of the Iraqi state to stop rocket attacks on American bases. Now, you know that after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, there have been a number of rocket attacks on American bases or bases shared by both Iraqis and Americans. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Ahmed Al-Kinani, who is a political analyst. He's joining us from London. Ahmed, as always, thank you for your time and for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of the arrest of these Kataib Hezbollah members?
Thank you for having me. The way we understand this raid on Kataib Hezbollah is there's two ways to actually read it. One of it is Al-Kadhimi was trying to send a signal for the Popular Mobilization Forces that the days of Adil Abdel Mahdi has ended. You can't do whatever you want in Iraq. I'm trying to force the Iraqi kind of state. And also he's trying to show the American that he is their man in Iraq and he's willing to stand in the face of these groups to gain more support. I think everyone is talking about this, the raid and emphasizing the significance of it. There were times during the post-2003 period where you've got al-Maliki, Ayad Allawi, previous prime ministers, have fought against military groups in Iraq. Maliki fought Jaish al-Mahdi in Basra in 2008, and you've got Allawi fought also against Jaish al-Mahdi in Najaf in 2004. And both of these attacks on the armed groups were backed by the Americans. As you said in your introduction, Iraq post Muhandis and Soleimani is completely different. It's mostly America trying to settle it's a problem with Iran via Al-Kinani. It's trying to say we will be the influencer in Iraq, and Al-Kinani would be the tool to actually carry out this change against the Popular Mobilization Forces.
I wonder, though, Ahmed, Kataib, Hezbollah, PMF, I mean, it's not like they're weak forces, right? They can make life very hard for Kadhimi. How will he possibly keep all sides happy?
I don't think Kadhimi would be able to do that. I think basically Kadhimi was trying to get the Americans on his side by going and raid Kataib Hezbollah. I'm not sure if you and the viewers are aware, Kataib Hezbollah were the ones who were against the appointment of Al-Kadhimi as a prime minister. They are accusing him of leaking information to the Americans about the whereabouts of Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, and facilitated the raid on their vehicle that led to the death of both of them. So Kataib Hezbollah is very suspicious about the appointment of Al-Kadhimi. It could be understood as Kadhimi was trying to, again, show the Americans that he's their man, or he's trying to actually tell the Popular Mobilization Forces and Iran that their times in Iraq has ended. That is, he's trying to force the Iraqi state and trying to kind of create some soulless sovereignty, if I can use that term. He would never make everyone happy because let's not underestimate, there's an anti-American sentiment as well in Iraq. And there's a lot of supporters for the Hashid. And again, as you said in your introduction, labeling the Hashid being pro-Iran is debated. I think they meet with Iran on matters regarding foreign policies. There's a lot of Shia in Iraq who still have this anti-American sentiment, anti-Israeli sentiment, and their views are converging with Iran, converging with Hezbollah in Lebanon, hence the formation of the axis of Mahwar al-Muqawama, the so-called axis of resistance.
And, Ahmed, this is all as the United States is talking about, leaving Iraq at some level, right? Because we had the Iraqi parliamentary vote, as you well remember, after the assassination of Muhandis and Soleimani, where a lot of Iraqi parliamentarians, I know some, of course, boycotted that meeting. They voted to have the American forces, leave the country. What do you think would happen after that? I mean, it would seem like American influence will go down significantly in the country.
Definitely. America still have a commitment to Iraq. In 2003, they raided the country, they brought in institutions to ground, and America still have this guilt. Hence, they can't leave Iraq like that. So to some extent, America has some commitment to Iraq, trying to help rebuilding it the way they want to rebuild it, economically, militarily, and if it's analytically correct, they want to create a client state similar to the Gulf countries. This is something that many Iraqis are opposing, but equally America, I don't think America would actually just leave Iraq because of the strategic location of Iraq, being very close to Iran, between Iran and Israel. So America would not just let Iraq go to the hand of Iran and make it very close to for the Iranian to create the so-called road between Syria and Lebanon and Iran.
And then as a final thought, then before I let you go, Ahmed, let's talk about the Iran factor in all of this, right? Because as you well put it in your earlier answer, we're continually seeing this proxy war essentially play out on Iraqi soil. I mean, even the killing of Muhandis and Soleimani was the very perfect example of that in the Iranian response that we saw with those rocket attacks, right? So do you think that Iraq will at any point in the near future be able to have completely independent both domestic and foreign policy, independent of both Iranian and American influence?
I don't see this in in the near future, to be honest. It's very difficult for Iraq to form its own foreign policy and its economic policy. unfortunately, Iraq under two pressures. You have Iran forming its foreign policy because of the majority Shia in the parliament, and you have America being the occupier, the one who liberated it from Saddam, is forcing its economic and it's trying to change its foreign policy. I don't see Iraq forging a foreign independent or economic policy in the near future, and that's because the country is very fragile. Institutions in Iraq are still immature. Its economic policy is still not mature as well, and it's the likelihood of forming such thing it's impossible, I would say.
Very well, Ahmed. We'll leave it there at that, but we do really appreciate your time today and, of course, for your insight and putting that all into context for us and our viewers. The raid on Kataib Hezbollah's base, viewers, was an important one. It's a signal, as Ahmed there said, that Kazemi is trying to send to this group, which opposed his appointment, as Ahmed there correctly pointed out in one of his answers. Nevertheless, he will have to figure out a way to live with this group as well, because it's extremely powerful in the country. So whether we like it or not, and we can debate that till there is no tomorrow, whether PMF, Kataib Hezbollah, is a good thing for the country or not, nevertheless, they are a reality on the ground. And no Iraqi prime minister, no Iraqi politician can completely ignore their reality and try to control them, because they seem to be, at this point in time, at least beyond the control of the prime minister as well, to some extent. So will Iraq, as I had asked Ahmed, always remain within this battle between the Americans and the Iranians on Iraqi soil? And that seems to be the reality that Iraq will be living with for some time into the long-term future even. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.